Yes, okay. Very good. One more, please. Good, good. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Right here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Everybody, good afternoon. I'm Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President. Great to see such a great turnout today. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this policy forum event, Meaningful Inclusion of Young People as Drivers of Peace. This event is taking place on the sideline of the 2019 ECOSOC Youth Forum, an annual event that provides a platform for young leaders from around the world to engage in a dialogue among themselves and with United Nations member states and to share how they are working to advance peace in their countries. Allow me to take a moment to thank our partners for this event, the United Nations Peacebuilding Support Office, the United Nations Population Fund, Peace Direct, Interpeace, and in particular, the Office of the President of the UN General Assembly. Thank you to you all. As I'm sure many of you know or remember, not that long ago, and I suppose still in some quarters, conversations around youth focused on the growing numbers of youth, in particular in the developing world, as a problem. A security risk that needed to be mitigated. Either that or youth conversations were framed around the idea that youth are a precious resource for the future that needs to be cultivated and protected. Only a resource for the future. But what has become clear by the energetic participation of young people around the world on a whole host of issues, and in particular, recently I'm thinking about the extraordinary youth mobilization around climate action, for example, is that young people do not simply represent the future. They are the present. They are showing leadership on many issues of fundamental concern. Not part of a problem for older people to solve, they are themselves actively part of the solution. Young people are engaged in creative ways in preventing violence, sustaining peace, and promoting sustainable development around the world. We have a great panel to discuss this issue, and particularly what it means to meaningfully involve young people. But before we get to that, we will have two opening speakers. We will hear remarks from Mr. Derhe Wardofa, Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA. Thank you again for your partnership on this event. Here you go. Thank you for your partnership. But first, it is my honor to introduce Her Excellency Maria Fernanda Espinosa, President of the 73rd Session of the United Nations General Assembly. Before becoming PGA, she served twice as Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ecuador, as well as Minister of Defense and Permanent Representative to the UN in New York and in Geneva. A committed multilateralist, she has dedicated the 73rd Session to making the UN relevant for all. I have my pin on. Which includes a focus on youth, peace, and security as one of her official top priorities. Madam President, welcome back to IPI. The floor is yours.
I also applaud. And well, good afternoon, and dear Adam Lupel, Vice President of the International Peace Institute, Mr. Derhe Wardofa, Deputy Executive Director of UNFPA, Excellencies, distinguished panelists, dear friends, I am really delighted to be here and to be partnering again with the International Peace Institute. Thank you, Adam and colleagues, for your steadfast support during my presidency of the General Assembly. And warm thanks also to our partners today, the Peacebuilding Support Office, UNFPA, Peace Direct, and Interpeace, for all your help with this event. ahead of my presidency, I resolved to make youth, peace and security one of my priorities. And I set myself a challenge to do whatever I could to ensure youth voices are not just heard, but listened to in the halls and meeting rooms across the road. Every major event I convene has a strong youth focus and youth participation. Ahead of key meetings, my team reaches out to young people online so their ideas, their concerns, their criticism can inform our discussions. And wherever I go, I seek to meet with youth representatives. Today, I am proud to be accompanied by the very talented Noor Soliman, a high school student from Canada who is shadowing me today and who has made a name for herself with inspiring speeches on women's empowerment and human rights. I'm grateful to the Permanent Mission of Canada for setting this up and allowing Noor and I to spend the day together. So that's great. Noor is here sitting with us today. She's 15 years old and you cannot imagine how intelligent, how strong she is. So it is a privilege to share my agenda with her today. So, dear friends, I am sure that you, like me, are encouraged that there is now, as Adam was mentioning, finally momentum on youth, peace and security. While the UN has worked on related issues for decades, the focus has often been on the most extreme situations. Child soldiers, for instance, or survivors of sexual violence, and this is, of course, absolutely crucial, of course. But we must not forget that fully 1/3 of all young people today live in fragile and conflict-affected zones. They want to learn, to be healthy, to have jobs, just like young people everywhere. For many of them, becoming a peace actor, an activist, a mediator, a humanitarian isn't a choice. It is part of their daily lives. It's what they need to do to get on with their daily lives, to build a future for themselves and for their families. So it is commendable that ECOSOC is engaging with youth, peace and security issues, and that the General Assembly and ECOSOC have teamed up to organize the interactive dialogue between member states and youth representatives just today. I'm actually coming from there. It is excellent that we have Security Council resolutions 2250 and 2419, which I'm sure we will hear more about from our speakers today. But for this agenda to be truly effective, we need to make progress in 3 key areas, and I won't be long. First, youth, peace and security must be actively embraced by the whole of the UN membership. It must be embedded in all pillars of our work, and in short, we need action in the General Assembly. This has been one of my objectives this year, and I hope that my successor and you all will continue to push for youth, peace and security to become central to the Assembly's work. Second, we must change the narrative on youth. I want to pay tribute here to Graham Simpson, whose excellent Missing Peace report laid out so clearly the extent to which policymakers still see young people as a problem, as a demographic time bomb of unemployment, fertility, and violence. What about the demographic dividend, the peace dividend that this generation, the largest, most educated, most globally minded in history, can deliver for peace? We must find ways to encourage politicians and the media to adopt a more positive narrative. And third, young people must be included in decision-making, period. We will not make progress on youth, peace and security without making progress on broader civic, political and economic inclusion of young people. That was the summary of our debate and conversation this morning. That includes participation at the UN, where youth perspectives are still viewed by some as something novel or nice to have, rather than integral to our discussions. Dear friends, I hope we can make progress on all these fronts in the coming months and in the lead up to the UN's the 75th anniversary next year. Let me close by echoing a plea from young people interviewed for the 10-year review of the Mackle study on the impact of armed conflict on children, and I quote, "Some come to help us, but they never really ask what we need. They end up giving us what they think we need. We ask that you empower us. We do not want to be called in when you have already made the decisions. We want to work hand in hand with you." End of quote, and thank you.
Madam President of the General Assembly, Your Excellencies, the panelists, ladies and gentlemen, and my colleagues. I am very much delighted to be here today to participate in this occasion. Importantly, I've been working in peace and social justice for many years before I joined UNFPA, or the UN's family. And I really admire the work of institutions like the International Peace and also individuals who are committing themselves to peace and justice across the world. UNFPA is very proud to have supported with the Peacebuilding Support Office the development of the Missing Peace, the independent progress study on youth, peace and security. We now have a blueprint for the implementation of youth, peace and security agenda. I would like to commend the President of the General Assembly for her commitment to youth and peace and security. Her leadership on this agenda is critical for political support and operational implementation. We thank you. The reform of the United Nations Peace and Security Pillar, as well as the reform of the UN development system, give us a unique opportunity to reconfigure our engagement with young people, their organizations and networks. We should not miss this opportunity. The UN Youth Strategy, Youth 2030, identified peace and resilience building as one of the 5 priority areas of the UN's work on youth, placing the youth, peace and security at the core of the priorities of the UN on youth. UNFPA is deeply committed to support the implementation of resolutions 2250 and 2419 and to take forward the key recommendation of the progress studies that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Our main priorities of this operational phase are the following: support youth networks and organizations for their work on development, humanitarian, and peace and security issues. Strengthen the capacities of youth organizations so that they are equipped to receive funds, implement well-designed programs, and monitor and evaluate their work. Continued advocating for young people to be fully engaged in development, humanitarian, and peace-building processes. Facilitating young people's participation in human rights mechanisms. Facilitating young people's participation in human rights mechanisms ensures the generation and use of age and sex disaggregated data so that we have quantitative information we need about young people. Ensure access to sexual and reproductive health information and services, value-based education, including comprehensive sexuality and life skill education for most marginalized youth, particularly young women and adolescent girls, as part of comprehensive package of health interventions. We are also celebrating this year in Nairobi 25th anniversary of the Program of Action of the International Conference on Population and Development. Young people and their contributions to peace will be an important dimension of our common road to Nairobi, emphasizing the power of youth participation and the leadership of women and men. Thank you again for IPI for hosting this important discussion today. I look forward to our discussions. Thank you.
thanks again to both of our welcoming speakers, the President of the General Assembly and Mr. Warfa from UNFPA. My name is Jake Sherman. I'm the President, giving myself a promotion on the spot apparently. I'm the Director of IPI Center for Peace Operations, and it's my pleasure to wish you a good afternoon and welcome you. I think we have a great panel today here to focus on the role of young people as drivers of peace and how international actors can advance meaningful participation and inclusion of young people. Acknowledging the positive contributions of youth in prevention is a critical step towards changing the narrative around youth that both of our opening speakers spoke of, and also towards increasing meaningful participation in issues of peace and security. And as we've heard, young people are important partners in working to strengthen resilience, to promote sustainable development, and to prevent the spread of violence, crime, and corruption. And as the Youth Progress Study noted, one of the key recommendations actually coming out of that is a very strong call to increase representation, meaningful representation of youth in decision-making at all levels, at the local level, national, regional, and international level. But what actually constitutes meaningful political inclusion and participation of young people? How can this be achieved? And how can champions of this agenda at the United Nations, among member states, and elsewhere best support these efforts? So here today to help us consider these questions, I have Mr. Moussa Tolo, the president of Allo Gouvernance, and Moussa is actually going to speak in French. So if you need, there's translation devices. English will be on channel 1, French will be on channel 2. Allo Gouvernance is a youth-led organization that trains women and young adults in conflict management skills to promote peace and social cohesion in the Mopti region of Mali. And Adil Scali, program manager at the United Nations Association in Canada. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Ms. Saran Kita Kitai, chair of the West African Network for Peacebuilding, was unable to travel to join us. Following reflections from Moussa and Adil, Mr. Graham Simpson, the principal representative and senior peacebuilding advisor at Interpeace USA, and of course, lead author of the independent progress study on youth, peace, and security, will highlight the study's recommendations. And then we'll hear from Ms. Vanessa Wyeth, Senior Political and Public Affairs Officer from the Permanent Mission of Canada to the United Nations, who will discuss more about how member states are supporting this agenda and what could be done. So with that, Melissa, let me turn to you. You have the floor.
Bonsoir à tous. Je me nomme Moussa Tolo, comme l'a dit mon prédécesseur. Eh bien, je suis très heureux de participer à cette activité qui permet aux jeunes de pouvoir s'exprimer et de dire ce qui se passe au sein de notre communauté et de voir comment est-ce que nous pouvons avoir de l'aide pour vraiment accentuer les activités des jeunes dans nos activités pour la promotion de la paix et de la cohésion sociale. Bon, à Mopti, comme il a dit, nous sommes une association de jeunes gens, pas seulement ceux qui sont allés à l'école, mais aussi ceux qui n'ont pas été à l'école, mais qui ont des qualificatifs socio-professionnels. Et nous, notre activité principale, c'est le civisme. On se dit chez nous que d'abord, on ne peut rien faire de bon sans pour autant aimer ce qu'on fait. Exemple, est-ce que quelqu'un qui aime son pays pourra prendre les armes comme ce pays? Non. Donc, la base chez nous, c'est le civisme et le patriotisme. Donc, à partir de cela, nous avons commencé à faire des missions de sensibilisation à Mopti, au centre, qui n'est plus à vous présenter vu les activités vu les atrocités qui se sont passées ces 2 dernières semaines au Mali. Bon, nous, nos activités par rapport à la paix, c'est d'abord les balades nocturnes. Les balades nocturnes consistent à faire des groupes d'amis qui sont dans des grains. Nous en parlons de paix, de cohésion sociale. Aussi, nous leur demandons quel serait leur rôle pour le retour de la paix locale et aussi au niveau national. Et avec ça, nous avons beaucoup de solutions. Ils nous disent ce qu'ils pensent réellement. Et aussi, nous avons une autre activité que nous appelons l'école de la paix. Et cette école de la paix permet aux enfants qui n'ont souvent pas la possibilité d'exprimer leur perception de la paix, leur perception sur tout ce qui se passe, de communiquer avec eux. Donc nous, dans les écoles, on parle de paix, de cohésion sociale, mais surtout de patriotisme et de civisme. Et avec cette activité, les enfants ils parviennent à vraiment parler et dire ce qu'ils pensent. En outre de cela, nous avons une autre activité qui est les concerts, les activités récréatives. Nous invitons de grands nombres de jeunes et là, nous faisons des concours de poésie, de slam sur la paix et autres. Et aussi, nous amenons même des artistes, des rappeurs qui font des prestations sur la paix. Et là, ça nous permet de toucher un maximum de personnes dans nos activités. En outre de cela, nous avons aussi des assemblées générales où nous invitons des femmes, et des hommes, nous asseyons, nous parlons de ce qui ne va pas et essayons de voir comment est-ce que nous pouvons trouver des solutions adéquates pour réparer. Et dernièrement, vu tout ce qui se passe à Mopti, nous avons aussi initié une autre activité et ça, c'est grâce à Peacebuilding. Et il s'agit de prendre des enfants qui ont quitté leur zone et qui ne sont plus à l'école mais qui sont de l'autre côté de Mopti. Nous les avons pris, nous les amenons à l'école et nous assurons qu'il y ait de l'éducation efficace. Parce que nous disons que si un enfant n'est pas très bien éduqué, il risque d'être un problème à l'avenir pour son pays. Et là, il va falloir que la personne soit instruite et qu'il comprenne les règles même d'une bonne société. Laisser les enfants dans la rue, ça peut le rendre vulnérable. Et la rue, dans la rue, on peut être en rapport avec plusieurs, pas seulement civilisations, mais plusieurs choses qui peuvent être bonnes comme mauvaises. Mais à l'école, on apprend beaucoup de choses. Donc nous, ces enfants, nous les recueillons, nous les amenons à l'école pour qu'ils puissent apprendre, même si nos moyens sont beaucoup maigres à ce niveau. En outre de cela aussi, nous faisons la prévention sur l'extrémisme violent. Nous avons des jeunes, nous connaissons plutôt des jeunes qui sont dans les groupes d'autodéfense, des groupes de milices et autres. Pourquoi? Parce que souvent, pour la plupart, ils n'ont pas de quoi s'occuper. En fait, au Mali, la jeunesse compose plus de 60% de la jeunesse. Et malheureusement, cette jeunesse n'est pas active. Et là, ça pose un problème. Toute cette jeunesse au Mali, nous allons voir qu'elle ne fait rien, absolument rien. Si nous prenons le taux de jeunes qui travaillent et le taux de jeunes qui ne travaillent pas. Et pour la plupart, ils sont tentés par les groupes armés et autres, ils vont dans les groupes armés. Et en outre de cela, ces jeunes qui vont dans les groupes armés, ils vont pour plusieurs raisons. Mais l'une des plus grandes raisons, c'est pour avoir accès à l'armée. Parce que pour eux, c'est un chemin plus facile pour être dans l'armée malienne. Vu qu'il y a des histoires de DDR maintenant qui sont là, donc ils font tout pour avoir des armes, vraiment pour être dans ce truc-là. Et souvent, quand ça n'aboutit pas, ce sont eux qui sont les petits bandits dans les coins de rue et nous avons vraiment des problèmes. En tant que jeune, je pense qu'il serait encore mieux de faire des efforts pour qu'il y ait pour que ces jeunes aient accès non seulement à l'éducation, mais aussi à l'emploi. Parce que quand on est occupé, on n'aura vraiment pas ce temps de pouvoir se donner à ces choses qu'on fait. Et je vous remercie. Avec d'autres questions, peut-être je pourrais encore plus donner d'amples explications. Merci bien.
Thanks very much. It was, I think a great example of youth-led, citizen-driven solutions to the problems sort of on that. facing their community. So with that, Adil, let me turn to you to give us a slightly different perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. My perspective is going to give a glimpse of the YPS agenda and how it is relevant at the national level in Canada, and talk just a tiny bit about what young people are doing in terms of peace building at a local level. And the reason I want to stress the relevance of the YPS agenda at the Canadian context is because there's always a question about why is it relevant in a Canadian context if it is a country that is relatively in peace and quite encouraging of youth participation. And quickly the answers are quite clear. And so through the work that we have done at the UN Association in Canada was a series of consultations on youth peace and security, and we heard from a number of youth and youth organizations on their priorities and their take on the Resolution 2250. To start off, youth take on peace building work through a number of different initiatives in Canada and activities and organizations. The main activities in peace building is done at the very local level through community centers and groups and support organizations. There's also incredible work being done by civil society organizations, advocacy organizations, and a growing and thriving industry in Canada is the sector of the social enterprise and impact-driven initiatives. And what we're seeing is that many Canadians are putting themselves through a number of challenges, getting pay cuts if that's what it takes, to work for an organization that they believe in and that has an impact on the issues that they feel are important. But taking it back to 2250, the youth that we spoke to really selected 3 priority pillars that are relevant to Canada. And those are participation, protection, and prevention. And we're looking at, well, like many of you would agree, there is a broad consensus on the clarity regarding the definition of youth, as well as there is a recognition that although direct active armed conflict does not exist in Canada, it is not necessarily a country in a state of peace. So in terms of identifying the lack of opportunities for youth, we've identified a number of different barriers. And participation exists in Canada in many different forms. However, meaningful participation is what lacks, and equitable participation is something that we need to work on at the national level. There was a lot of conversations about the importance of working and improving relations with our Indigenous peoples, as well as prioritizing sustainable and equitable economic development as important steps towards the prevention of conflict. Finally, our findings found that, or highlighted the inadequate protection of young people from social harm in Canada, notably folks from vulnerable groups and Indigenous peoples. So in terms of how Canada is doing regarding youth peace and security issues, very significantly from person to person and group to group based on lived experiences. And we saw a great dichotomy between folks living in different parts of Canada. However, there are a few key areas that we need to address, notably managing gun violence, ensuring street safety especially for women and girls and women of color, and education and providing access to education, especially for girls and Indigenous peoples. Providing an avenue of protection through legal systems to protect from social harm, and of course encouraging community engagement and participation, especially in the rural areas and especially amongst men and boys in rural areas. So our report really arrived at a conclusion that Canada is not necessarily excelling in any of the 5 pillars for action, and that there was a recognition that the absence of war does not equate peace. There is an overarching recognition amongst our constituents that the importance of working towards peace at the individual and micro level is important before really talking about a national level program or policy. So in terms of the 3 pillars, participation, protection, and prevention, we'll start with participation and talk a little bit about the 2 main barriers preventing young Canadians from participating in peace building. There is a perceived lack of opportunity for youth to meaningfully participate in politics and decision making at any level, And in addition, it's a lack of access or inequitable access is a major barrier. So recognizing that folks from different vulnerable groups need more support to participate. Recognizing that conflict emanates from inequality, there is an inextricable link between youth participation and socioeconomics and security, including structural violence, socioeconomic inequality, and systemic marginalization of minority groups. And in this case, it's specific to immigrants, refugees, LGBTQ plus communities, the disabled, and the indigenous peoples. And should Canada not address and prioritize those community groups and those vulnerable groups in Canada, conflicts may arise in the near future. Second, we cannot expect participation of people with a hungry stomach. Hunger and access to water is a big issue in certain communities in Canada, and it goes back again to the equitable access to participatory activities. It was emphasized that basic needs, water, food, and shelter must be met as prerequisites to any kind of participation, particularly outside of urban areas. In terms of prevention, to prevent conflict, a lot of Canadians believe that there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of breaking the silos within which communities live in Canada. And it is necessary to address our relations with Indigenous peoples, not only to activate the process of decolonization, but also in order to prevent potential conflicts that could arise in the future. Economic development was also a highlight as a crucial priority in prevention, particularly in relation to creating adequate employment opportunities for youth, providing young people with alternative education, as well as ensuring adequate infrastructure for jobs and language learning for newcomer Canadians and refugees to promote integration and prevent violent extremism. Likewise, realigning the education systems and outcomes to 21st century skills to avoid large unemployment within the youth demographic. Finally, in terms of protection, there is a broad consensus that young people are not being adequately protected from social harm in Canada. So they identified the protection of Indigenous communities and other marginalized or minority groups, particularly women, individuals identifying as LGBTQ+, immigrants and refugees, should feature prominently in the security discourse. The suicide epidemic on reserves should be addressed urgently, while sexual and gender-based violence need to be addressed more explicitly. Canada's unlawful treatment of immigrant youth in detention centres was also raised as an important area of improvement. There is a lot of work to be done in terms of the inadequate ways in which mental health issues are being addressed, including drug abuse, domestic violence, sexualization of women, cyberbullying, and xenophobia, and how those are treated within the legal systems. In this regard, youth recommended capacity building and education as ways to promote unity and integration, dispel biases and prejudices, and support rehabilitation, rebuilding, and reintegration. In terms of global issues, youth delegates prioritized the importance of protecting civilians and youth, particularly young girls in conflict zones. A desire to see more women in peacekeeping missions was highlighted several times, and the need for Canada to provide increased aid towards access to education and health services for girls was also emphasized, with the general support for Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy. So to conclude, the YPS agenda and 2250 is highly relevant in the Canadian context, and there are a lot of gaps that need to be filled. However, not to leave the room on a negative tone, there is incredible work being done at the local level, and we are seeing incredible or fascinating efforts done by young people across communities, and perhaps starting from a national level and hoping for a trickle-down effect will help empower young youth organizations and youth-led organizations to implement productive and efficient peace-building projects.
Great. Thank you very much, Adil. I think it's a really comprehensive reminder of the universality of the YPS agenda, and I think particularly some of the issues you raised around the access to political participation, social services for vulnerable people, for indigenous groups. I mean, I think many of us in our own countries could learn a lot from Canada's approach. So thank you for that. Graham, let me turn things over to you.
Thank you. And let me begin by thanking the officers of the PGA, DPPA, UNFPA, Peace Direct, and IPI for making this event possible, and for, along with my organisation, Interpeace, giving me this platform. I have to say I'm really struck just by listening to Musa and Adil by how much we have to learn from young people. We treat as such a complex, difficult exercise translating policy into operational implementation, and they kind of seamlessly, in the description of the everyday activities, illustrate how this is done in practice. It resonates so strongly with what I heard from young people who were not waiting for us to invent a sustaining peace agenda, but were working across all phases of conflict, with different types of conflict and violence, from the most local to the most global level, the sort of inspiration of watching young people in action. And so in some ways the starting point of a conversation about what is meaningful inclusion and meaningful participation is in the methods of this study, which was deliberately driven by an inclusive participatory process of making sure that young people who would not normally have a voice in these policy making endeavors were the progenitors of the content. This study, I rashly made the promise that when we presented it to the Security Council, that young people couldn't see and hear themselves, we had failed. And I think this is really powerful, because it is the quality of the data, the quality of the study, the quality of the recommendations are about young people's participation. They're about young people's voice. They're about the inclusive discourse facilitated by partnerships with civil society organizations that created this extraordinary access. And so if we want to talk about meaningful inclusion, the starting point is in the making of policy. Young people have illustrated through the progress study on youth, peace and security, the missing piece, how important it is that their voices are in the mix, and partly because of the practical, concrete ways in which they translate these policies into implementation. So that would be my starting point. I'm very grateful that the conversation about meaningful participation, because young people throughout the exercise of the study were incredibly eloquent in describing the systemic, integrated, holistic experiences of exclusion as injustice in their lives. And yet they posed the question all the time, if that's the problem we have to deal with, what does meaningful inclusion look like? What does meaningful participation look like? And I wanted to some extent try and reflect some of their voices on this. Young people were very clear on how the stereotypes, very gendered stereotypes, when we talk about peace and security, young men with guns, young women consigned to the passive status of victimhood, how those stereotypes marginalize young people because they deprive them of their agency, they deprive them of their activity in generating peace as progenitors of peace, rather than seeing young people as a problem. That this reinforces the marginalization that comes and exclusion that comes with policy myths, assumptions based on little evidence, and there's lots of evidence in the study to contradict them, that bulges in the youth population, that youth migration, that all young people are in danger of joining extremist armed groups. These policy assumptions that drive a hard security approach to young people at the expense of an investment in their extraordinary resilience. And I would argue that it is the investment in young people's creative resilience that is about inclusion. The securitization of young people, the stereotypes, the policy myths and assumptions with which we exclude them are part of the problem. Young people, their exclusion and marginalization is also compounded by the data gaps. The governments don't keep age and gender disaggregated data that is useful. We can't drive youth inclusion policies that we can measure and assess by reference to the data, because the data is not kept. And so there's a really important dimension here about resolving those data gaps. But what's really powerful is the comprehensive way in which young people describe their exclusion. They talked about the violence of exclusion, the structural nature of it. And in this, I have to say, this is really important to how we think about what meaningful inclusion looks like. Because on the one hand, young people were not just talking about exclusion in formal processes. They weren't just talking about elections and political participation, although this was very important. Young people were saying, look at where we interface with our states. Where is the state-society relationship manifest in its relationship to young people? And it was amazing the examples they raised. Young people described the primary interface with the state often as being in relation to the criminal justice system or in relation to education. And young people would describe these two examples. These are exercises that are all about us, but we have no say, we have no power, we have no role in the policy making around criminal justice reform or in the definition of educational priorities and educational curricula. And so political participation and meaningful political participation was in all these arenas that affected young people's lives, and not just consigned to a narrow definition of formal political engagement. Young people were very articulate in saying how exclusion was gendered, the unique and distinct experiences of young girls as opposed to young men, and the importance of engaging masculinity and forms of masculinity that were not dependent on control and access to young women as alternatives, so that gender didn't become one of the vehicles of exclusion. Young people talked about a loss of trust, not just in political systems from which they felt marginalized, but a loss of trust in economic systems that were producing increasing levels of inequality, greater difficulties in access to the economy. And young people were saying, yes, jobs are important, but we're not economic automatons. This is about meaning, it's about civic engagement, about jobs that matter, and it's about going beyond just jobs and recognizing young people have a stake, a desperate need for a stake if their participation is meaningful in defining the development strategies in their world. Young people talked about inclusion in critical ways. It was fascinating to hear young people often say, you know, you're constantly talking about inviting us to sit at your table, and yet we are setting our own tables, and it's critical that you come to us. The creative and innovative ways in which young people are engaging in political transformation, in change. Yes, sometimes in peaceful protest and dissent, in disruptive activity that is about driving change. Young people are saying embrace rather than treat this as a problem, because it is about how we drive innovative change in societies. I've already mentioned how they're working at different phases, from early intervention, prevention models in schools with younger and younger children, right through to post-conflict peace building and peace settlements. Young people are working from the most local level, intimate, family-based, person-to-person peace building in schools and communities, right through to the global networks that drove and gave life to Resolution 2250. Young people are working across different typologies of violence and understand the complex connections between them, whether it's gender-based violence and female genital mutilation, or it's about terrorist violence, or it's about political and criminal violence. Young people are working in the most interesting and innovative partnerships with local governments, with women's organizations, with civic organizations, etc. And finally, they are occupying new and creative mechanisms through culture, through sports, through art, through the critical occupation of cyberspace and social media. These are all creative tools that provide young people with forms of direct action, rather than just assuming this is about representation and representative politics. So there are four last things I want to say that really came out so strongly from the study. The first was young people said, if you want our inclusion to be meaningful, don't ghettoize us. Don't look for us just in youth organizations, because we're in women's organizations, we're in human rights organizations, we're in civic and trade union organizations. We are in the police, and we're in the communities being policed. And think about youth as a cross-cutting vehicle. Every SDG is a youth SDG. They said to us all the time, so that there's a recognition of this. The second is that young people's horizons have changed. Globalization has shifted the way in which young people see the world, from the boundaries of the community and the turf to an ability to see on your cell phone horizontal inequality across the world. And so we need to think about young people's participation not just as local and intimate, but as acting locally to impact globally. And last but not least, Young people talked about inclusion as not being unconditional. Young people don't want to be included in systems of patronage and corruption. Young people don't want to be included when it's symbolic or tokenistic. Young people don't want to be included where it's just to be trotted out to wave the flags of political parties at election time and no other time. So the meaningful inclusion is also about circumnavigating that. And then finally, young people talk about inclusion in a way that I think is very important for us to recognize is as much about accountability for implementing this agenda as anything else. So the issues of inclusion don't stop when we finish the progress study or when we're thinking about participation in these spaces. It's young people who need to be consulted on what the indicators are of progress on this agenda. When is meaningful progress being achieved in their countries? Let's continue the participation so that young people's inclusion becomes part of how we hold the multilateral system and governments accountable for implementing these resolutions.
Graham, thanks so much. A 5-minute summary of quite a nose. Either way, the report, of course, is a serious piece of work reflecting all of the work that went into the types of consultative process that you mentioned. And I think the fact that you're able to so eloquently summarize the key takeaways is incredibly useful in this context. So thank you for that. Finally, Vanessa, let me turn to you for a member state perspective on how to support this agenda, particularly for a like that across the street.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to IPI for including me on this panel, and to the PGA and all the organizers for organizing this important discussion. I've been frantically rewriting my notes because so many of the points I wanted to make have been made much better than I could have made them. But just to start by saying, Canada is a huge fan of this study, and we're very happy to have supported it financially, and particularly the process by which it was conducted, this incredibly inclusive, participatory, groundbreaking process. And so the first point I wanted to make is the last one that Graham just made, which is the importance of making sure that the community that was built, or the communities that were there, but that the broader global community that was built in developing the recommendations has to be the one leading and engaged in taking it forward in implementing the solution. So what I'd like to do is just offer a few thoughts on kind of from a member state perspective what we see as kind of the priorities for taking this forward, and then I asked colleagues in Ottawa who are in charge of programming and things like that, some lessons that we maybe can take from our own programming. This is now more kind of our program is Global Affairs Canada, and some of the challenges that we're facing in taking it forward. And so just to start by noting, it's been noted this is a universal agenda, but what I think the progress study does so well is show how holistic an agenda it is. It is one of the rare studies that I've seen come out of the UN or anywhere that actually brings together different aspects of prevention, whether we're talking about violent extremism, violent conflict, or violent crime. Those tend to be little silos within even the peace and security community that we've created for ourselves. And so I think that some of the power of the study is just in that alone. These are challenges that really push governments to think about how we address these issues, right? So just looking at Canada in terms of who is engaged on the youth peace and security agenda, and I was talking about this with Adil, it's Public Safety Canada, it's Global Affairs when it comes to our programming, it's the Ministry of Defense when it comes to things like child soldiers. I mean, there's a whole number of other government agencies, so just getting us to talk to each other is, as everyone knows, a challenge. But then even within Global Affairs, there are a number of different departments and divisions, right? So there's not a kind of youth peace and security department or lens. There's child protection that's dealt with by one area. There's prevention of violent extremism that's dealt with one branch. There's a branch that does peacebuilding. There's the kind of more traditional children's rights, or so it really is I think challenges us to think about how we look at these issues. What seems so salient to me is that when we're looking at things, the similarities of the messages that come out of this study with some of the other recent studies, particularly the UN World Bank study, Pathways for Peace, it's really what Graham has called the violence of exclusion, right? That is underpinning so much of the social harms and the problems that manifest themselves as different forms of violence. And that the solution for this really is the promotion of policies that actually build social, economic, and political inclusion, and building that notion of inclusion into every aspect of the way we approach this. And this is where that barrier that exists between, for example, PVE, prevention of violent extremism, and conflict prevention seems really artificial to me. Because when we're looking at upstream prevention, a lot of what you're looking at, our tools are primarily developmental. It's building human rights into the way we deliver development. It's delivering in an inclusive way that addresses kind of long-standing grievances in communities. And we're working in the same communities, sometimes targeting the same groups. And so, really challenging us to think a little bit more creatively about the way we do this. I'd say the second point that really came through for us is how, this is a universal agenda, it's holistic, but it needs to be very context specific in the way you address it, but it's incredibly intersectional. And what that looks like in every context is going to be different. And so I think this study does such a good job of problematizing a lot of the very lazy assumptions that have underpinned our work, and our assumptions about youth as a youth bulge, etc., and exposing the lack of evidence that underlies those assumptions. And so that's been, I think, very helpful. But we've also learned you can't really pursue peace building in a vacuum. You have to take, as it's come through so clearly, you have to look at the lived experiences of the communities you're dealing with, and look at the way basic services are delivered in these communities, and look at the ways in which horizontal inequalities and exclusion pervades service delivery, access to justice, access to education, access to jobs. And so, before the panel where I was talking to Musa about some of the work his organization does around road safety. So you wouldn't necessarily think peace building is road safety, but apparently, and I remember this from living in Niger, road accidents can be the source of conflicts that arise very quickly. And so obviously road safety is important, but it's also a peace building moment where you can, and a prevention moment. Some of our programming, for example, in South Sudan, has looked specifically at the need to address intergenerational issues around conflict and gender barriers. And so that's a way where you have to, looking at some of the issues that arise in certain communities and how to look at the way different members of those communities are impacted based on the identities that they have. We're, for example, working with young men through a program called The Hero and Me, where we are working to address harmful perspectives on gender, and ultimately with a view to preventing sexual and gender-based violence. And so I think that's something that obviously we have a lot of work to do on. I suspect part of the reason that I was invited on this to participate in this panel is because of a point that I continually make in some of the discussions on the YPS agenda, and it's very much based on the experience of Canada having funded through Peace Direct, the organization that Musa works with, and a number of other organizations in Mali. And this is the point about the way we finance and the sustainability of local-led and particularly youth-led peace building. I think we need to recognize that the most important work is really being done by civil society, and civil society in the most broadest sense. And at the grassroots and local level, this work often goes unrecognized, but when it does get recognized, it sometimes gets displaced or supplanted by kind of bigger projects that we fund. And then there have been very clear calls through the study and through the partners involved in the study for this work to be supported directly. That we don't need to build or find organizations to do this work, they're doing the work. We need to support the work they're doing. We need to come to them. So obviously, as donors, we try to find NGOs, and they have local partners that they work with, and but sometimes these are not very sustainable. There's a grant that lasts for 1 year, and then partners leave. Building sustainability into that is a challenge. But then also, we need to look at how to get creative, I think, about, as donor agencies, as donor governments, as the UN, we've set up some mechanisms to fund civil society directly, but they tend to be very massive grants. And so, for example, the Gender and Youth Promotion Initiative of the Peacebuilding Fund, which is a fantastic initiative, has grants starting at $300,000. Whereas what some of these organizations have told us, they don't need $300,000, they need $10,000. Well, the UN can't administer thousands and thousands and thousands of $10,000 grants, and so we need to get a little bit creative about how we partner, whether it's through other civil society organizations, to find modalities where we can support these organizations directly. I say this knowing that my own government doesn't always do it very well, and we all have our own challenges with this, but I think it's time for us to really be serious. We do a lot of focus on top-down peace building at the UN, but I think there's much more we can do to support some of the bottom-up work that really is where sustainability comes at the local level, and so much of it is being led by youth organizations. So I have more points I wanted to make, but I'll stop there, but I've been out of time. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Vanessa. I really like your last point about, as donors, I think, needing to meet local organizations, peace-building organizations where they are, rather than trying to get these organizations to align themselves to the rules and regulations and funding policies